Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Assalamu alaikum. We have attendees from various time zones here with us today. Thank you for joining us wherever you are. My name is Hamza Azmi. I'm the Knowledge Building Senior Program Officer at Musawa, and I'll be housekeeping during today's webinar. Welcome to our first book spotlight webinar focusing on women, households, and the hereafter in the Qur'an, a Patronage of Piety, featuring the work of Dr. Karen Bauer and Professor Feras Hamza, with discussant Professor Mulki Al-Sharmani and moderated by Dr. Sophia Rehman. Before I hand off the webinar to Dr. Sophia, I have a few housekeeping issues to share with you. First, this webinar is recorded and the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel later. Feel free to change your name for your privacy too when you're watching this webinar, when you're joining this webinar. We will have a question and answer session later. You are welcome to ask your question or share your comments in the chat or Q&A at any time during the webinar. If we don't get to your question today, please don't hesitate to get in touch via email with the email address on the slide. In the chat box, we will also be sharing resources and reference materials. We would appreciate it if you could also fill out our feedback form after the webinar, which will be shared in the chat. Your feedback is valuable for how we organize future webinars. If you are sharing the event on social media, please don't forget to tag us. So there's Musawa on X and Musawa Movement on Facebook and Instagram. You can also subscribe to our newsletter Vision for more updates on Musawa events like these. We have added the link for subscription in the chat. Dr. Sophia, the webinar is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Miza. Hello and assalamu alaikum to everybody. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to Musawa's first book spotlight event. We are very excited to have you all with us. I am your moderator for today, Sophia Rahman, and I am delighted to introduce our panel. I will very briefly introduce each of them, but my colleague will be providing more detailed bios for each of them in the chat too. So please do take a moment to read those as well. So we have the pleasure of discussing Dr. Karen Bauer and Professor Feras Hamza's latest book, Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an, a Patronage of Piety. Dr. Karen Bauer is an associate professor in Qur'anic studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. Her research centers on the Qur'an and its reception history, the history of emotions in Islam, and gender in Islamic history and thought, to name but a little of what she covers. Dr. Bauer is currently pursuing a cultural history approach to the Qur'an. She is also part of the Kitab project and co-editor of the ISIQ series for De Gruyter. Also with us today is Professor Feras Hamza. He is the head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong in Dubai and a research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. His research focuses on Qur'anic studies, early Islamic history, and hermeneutics, with works such as the Anthology of Qur'anic Commentaries series and Time and Narrative in the Qur'an. He also co-edits the Brill series, Islamic Literatures, Texts and Studies. Dr. Bauer and Professor Hamza have previously co-authored an Anthology of Qur'anic Commentaries Volume 2 on women, which comprises annotated translations of Qur'anic commentaries and extensive introductory materials, including a chapter on women in the Qur'an, which traces the history of Qur'anic interpretation, tafsir, through interpretations of verses on women. And finally, our discussant for today is Professor Mulki Al-Sharmani of the University of Helsinki. Her research focuses on Qur'anic ethics and gender, Islamic family law, Islamic feminism, and modern diasporas and transnational Muslim families. She emphasizes egalitarian ethics and legal reforms within Islamic frameworks. She has many publications to her name, the latest of which is Islamic Feminism, Hermeneutics, and Activism. As my colleague Hamiza has said, we welcome our audience to be engaged with discussion and to post your comments or questions in the chat box as we proceed, and we will pick these up at the end of the conversation to put to our panel. We very much want to be in conversation with our audience as well today. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Professor Mulki.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Welcome our audience and a warm welcome to my colleagues, Dr. Karen Bauer and Professor Feras Hamza. We're very happy to have you here with us, and we are honored and grateful that you are spending this afternoon with us to have a very fruitful, I'm sure, and engaging conversation about your very, very important book, which I devoured and read very carefully, and already you were generous enough also to engage in conversations with me, and today we have the privilege of having even a larger conversation. And I have few things that I'll discuss with you, and I'm sure the audience will have more. But first, Firas and Karen, the usual question, but also important question whenever we have a discussion about an important book. Why did you write this book? What is one or two main takeaway you want everybody to walk away from this conversation?
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. We are absolutely delighted to be here. It's a great honor to be addressing Musawa and your global audience. We're so honored and pleased that you're here discussing this book with us. So I think that this book stemmed from our previous project, which was on an anthology of Qur'anic commentaries, and my own work when I was starting out as an academic, and I published a book on the tafsir of certain verses, what I called the problematic verses, some problematic verses on women, such as Qur'an 434 and the testimony verse. And after I had done that monograph and talked about tafsir in the monograph, we did an anthology of Quranic commentaries, which is much more like a source book where we did a lot of translations. And we really just realized with really great clarity that we could not ethically leave it with the tafsir tradition. We had to actually understand what the Qur'an itself was saying about women, because the more and more and more we worked with the tafsir tradition, the more we realized that on this subject, there were really large inherent biases that the authors were bringing to their interpretations. And it started out with us thinking that we would do an article, and it really bloomed from there. I think that it surprised both of us. Actually, it's interesting because in the field of Quranic studies, the subject of women in the Quran seems to be a specialist thing that only feminists do. And I think that actually the size of the book surprised us. We didn't even intend to write a book. Then it became a book. We thought it would be a very short book. It is not at all a very short book. It's a big book. So that in a sense, yeah, we started not realizing how much there was to say, is what I'm trying to say. Feras, I'm sure you want to add something.
Well, first I want to add a kind of an expression of gratitude for this opportunity to address Musawa, and also for the invitation, and just to welcome everybody who's decided to join us for this webinar. Today, I think Karen kind of captured it very well by saying that we felt a deep sense of dissatisfaction with how a topic, or let me rephrase it, or how something that's called women in the Quran is kind of itemized and kind of becomes a topic that somehow is separate from everything else. And I think that was the real turnaround that we discovered through our months and months of plowing through the various tafsir traditions. I think we soon realized that actually if you do that to any topic in the Quran, you begin to miss a lot of what the Quran is doing, as it kind of continuously assembles and reassembles various aspects of human society to kind of galvanize its central message. And it was clear to us by the end of our kind of, work on the anthology that there was a much bigger story to tell, and that women were an extremely significant and central part of that story. And we couldn't do it justice through an anthology because, as Karen said, we would have had to write a very long, and we did in fact have something unusual from the first volume of the anthology. We had something called a long introduction. And that long introduction actually was a way of kind of us confronting ourselves and thinking we have to do something about this. So I think it naturally led to a kind of monographic study of the subject.
Thank you both so much. And you already kind of like paved the way for the key things we're going to talk about. So, and I'm just going to kind of like forecast the more or less the general themes that I'd like to discuss with you. And if I don't have a chance, all of them, I'm sure the audience will pick on some. One is precisely what you both said now, having to do with the centrality of the women to the key message of the Qur'an. The second will be about morality and piety as a pathway to salvation, which is the key theme for you. Then morality within a social structures. And then also, but also, what does that tell us about the nature of the Qur'anic law and ethics? And then how did you tell your story, your methodology? And certainly, what are the implications for us? So a lot to cover. As you can see, we are greedy because your book is so rich. But I'll take you back to the centrality of women to the key message of the Quran, which is what I take away and which you touched upon now. And to me, it shows that, and it also shows from the people who commented on your book at the back. So it's not only for people who are interested on the question of women and gender, but also if you are interested in the question of the nature of the Quran, if you are interested in the interplay between theology, ethics, and law within the worldview of the Quran. So in a way, I think, especially for those of us who work on gender, but other things, you're showing us that the question of women is really central and connected to other questions as well. And perhaps people who work on different things, including those who work on gender, need to take a note of that. Would you like to elaborate? In what way would you elaborate on that argument? Like, how is the question of women central to the key message of the Quran?
Well, I'll start because I'll elaborate by kind of correcting myself necessarily. And this is actually very important. This is where the problem of language interrupts us, because when we say, precisely as we've had to say right now, as I've had to say, that women are central to the Quran, it kind of almost reifies that into a thing that has to be remedied, because there's an assumption that the Quran is somehow has a bunch of stuff to say about women that it doesn't want to say or have to say about men. So I think it's partly the problem of the history of the subject of talking about women in the Quran that makes it into a thing. I think the Quran is not concerned in so much about men and women as men and women, rather than the human being, the fundamental nature of the human soul. And as it's embodied and as it has to go through this life journey of kind of moral tests and challenges and so on. So I'm not saying that to detract from the importance of discussing how women might be central to the Quran, but I do want to caution, I think, myself and us all, that actually even using the language of centrality suggests that women can be itemized in that way. And I think that there's a danger in that, because I do feel that the Quran is not kind of interested in any kind of competition between men and women. It just assumes that both have a job to get on with, and it's the same job: the moral trajectory, the moral transformation, the pious kind of awareness, and so it's just a qualification that sometimes our language carries us off into a direction that kind of forces us to talk about things in a particular kind of way. Having said that, let's just be practical and say, how is it that women are in fact central to the message? And I think there's many ways in which you can tackle that. And that's why, to take one of your points, our methodology began with a chronological, which is see how women first appear, or the female first appears in the Quranic narration, so to speak, right? So from the earliest Meccan verses to latest Madinese revelations. And it was clear that they were there from the outset, and it just grows and grows in importance in that chronological sequence. But of course, the Quran is not chronologically narrated. So then you have to go back and figure out, well, what's happening when you sort of put the verses back in their place and you read the Quran as the received text in that kind of recitational sequence. And then there's lots to say. There's everything from the kind of the equal duty upon both men and women for piety and for supporting each other. And that's why actually we kind of call it a patronage of piety, which I know sounds like, because patrons traditionally have been men, but actually on the contrary, on the Quran, the Quranic ideal for a patron or for somebody to look after others in a kind of moral or pious way is ungendered in that sense. And that's what the Quran is trying to say. But there are, numerous other examples. The stories that have women at their heart, I mean, are all extremely telling and very kind of indicative narratives. Perhaps we can talk about that at a later moment in the webinar. But I think that's just my kind of caution and my kind of realigning how we might think about women in the Quran. But I'll just hand over to Karen for a sec, as we usually do.
So I think that what Feras says is really important, that the first thing to remember is that the primary journey, what we always call the plot, the major plot of the Quran, is the salvific plot. It is, are you on the path? Are you on the plot trajectory to be saved, or are you not on the plot trajectory to be saved, right? And so men and women, as they appear in the Quran and as they appear addressed by the Quran, that is always the fundamental underlying question, which goes beyond all social class and anything that is outward of a human. Like, it goes beyond everything else, is that every single human being has moral agency. However, we have to recognize as well, which is also what we did recognize in our book, which is that the Quran, as we all know, was addressing a very highly stratified society that was not equal. It was not an egalitarian society. In fact, it was a society in which the idea of egalitarianism would have been absurd, social egalitarianism, because there simply were not the social structures in place for that until the modern period, when we have these governments who are willing to look after the poor sometimes. Keep in mind, still none of our societies are really actually egalitarian, okay, even though we have that ideal, okay? But it's addressing a society in which that notion that of social equality does not exist, okay? So within that, women actually assume also a great importance as the primary example of the way that somebody who you would think is socially disadvantaged still has absolutely full moral agency, right? So of course, we all know of the example of the wives of Noah and Lot who were under them, right? It says tahat, right? It means that there's the assumption is that there's a paterfamilias, a male head of household, and that everybody in the household is somehow, in a sense, in that person's domain. But those wives still had the moral agency to not be saved, just like the wife of Pharaoh and Miriam had the moral agency to be saved despite anything that was going on in the wife of Pharaoh's case, with her husband being the archetypical enemy of the believers and of Moses, and yet she is saved. And so in a society where there are slaves, where there's high social inequality, where then we can see that every single person in that society is promised this absolute egalitarianism of their potential for a spiritual trajectory. And I think that that's the very first, foremost, and most important thing to get across. But another thing to say is that just because the Quran recognizes that the society is unequal, it's not, I think that people misread it as a text that's kind of about instituting a social order that replicates itself. And that's not, I think that it's just saying, look, here we are, and yet everybody has equality of moral agency here, right? I don't think that I think it's a mistake to read it as though its primary aim is about social equality, because that just would not have been possible in that age, and it's just not. It couldn't be what that was about. So I don't know if that even answers your question, but it's certainly was one of the very key takeaways for me, that I think the lens that I'd read the Quran through the whole time was incorrect. That really we need to read it through the lens of the salvific narrative, and we need to then work down from there, right?
Yes, I think it actually, I will tie several things that both of you said, which are very enlightening. So going back to the centrality question and tied to what Karen said. So what I hear you both saying is I agree with you. It's not a matter of, men and women, but starting with the human being.
Yeah.
And what is the mission, and which is the salvation? How do you get there? Through piety, and then you unpack the piety. And in fact, what I mean by the centrality then is that if you look at the question of women through there, it creates a space. You're not stuck, you're not trapped in the between, is it egalitarian or not? Is it patriarchal or not? It opens up, first of all, it opens up the window into the larger theological, ethical question that the Qur'an within that text is putting forward. And then maybe it allows us to look at that question, as you're saying, Karen, through a layered way and through a historical way. And also leads me to the question of your developmental approach, which I will get to. So Feras, I take your point, absolutely, because it can be read as saying, well, yeah, women are important, not in that sense, but in the sense that it is intersects with another question, and we need to look at that question first, and we look at the question of the women and others within that larger question, which is the salvation, which is the ultimate aim. And to get there is through the piety, right? So would you unpack for us the piety? It seems to entail moral work, moral struggle, moral test. It also, you talk about how the importance of not seeing the private and the public as separate. They're all domains for moral work and for achieving that piety. So perhaps you could speak to that, since it's the pathway to the salvation, and unpack it for us a little bit.
I might warm my colleague up, Karen, by just suggesting the following, which is that I think I see this. This is a kind of almost how to say it, a habit of contemporary, I think, living, is that things are segregated, so that there's a realm of law, there's a realm of ethics, there's a realm of morality, there's a private sphere, there's a public sphere. There is a religious sphere, there's a secular sphere, and so there must then be certain religious acts and perhaps non-religious acts, or acts that do not impact any kind of religious objective, if one can. And I think what is clear from the Quran is that everything is a web, is a sacred web, potentially, or a desecrated web. I mean, everything is, every action, every interaction, as we, I think, say in our book, and perhaps not such a elegant style, but we certainly want to make the point that every action, every interaction, and every transaction is has value, and it can have sacred value, or it can have a kind of desecrated value. And so I think the idea that piety is simply the ritual worship as opposed to the behavior, the behavior towards others, the treatment of others, I think that has to be thrown out the window. It's very clear in the Quran that life in its entirety, precisely because of what, and I hope, by the way, that you can hear me. I did notice somebody in the chat saying, come closer. Am I more projecting now? Good, okay, thank you. I mean, the idea that, there are only certain things that apply for a kind of religious salvation and other things don't, I think that's wrong. I think it's clear from the Quran that as Karen was saying, the salvific, which for those our participants who are listening, the idea that the Quran at its heart is a message about the potential for being saved in the hereafter, that is after death. If that's the trajectory and that's the goal, then everything that you do now matters, and literally everything has a value. And so in that sense, piety, that opens up the concept of piety way beyond, you know, what is the traditional approach and perhaps scholarship, which is that it's ritualistic. It's very much about what you do as obligatory acts of religious worship or temples or cultic behavior and so on. So just as a way of kind of broaching that question.
That's
Karen?
exactly right. That's actually key. Scholars of late antiquity have noted that there's not even such a word as religion proper in that period. It's a concept that's kind of this modern concept of something that can happen separate to your life. But actually, in the Qur'an, of course, we know that what it says is that God is there, sees into the heart, right? Comes between the heart and the person, even is there, actually even seeing the interior of the person, right? So what we take issue with, and I think that you know, somebody like Izutsu with his ethico-religious concepts in the Quran, I mean, this is very path-breaking work, obviously. We have to recognize that somebody writing 50 years ago or whatever, and writing such a book, it's you know, there's path-breaking work there, but the whole idea that he would write a book on ethico-religious concepts and never include anything to do with women and divorce and all this stuff means he doesn't understand what ethics were in the Quran, right? Because what are ethics? It's how you treat people. It's how you are treating people. Why would the Quran, as you yourself and Umayma Abu Bakr have pointed out in an article, why do the divorce verses have so many ethical injunctions that about, you know, being decent, right? Treating them with bil ma'ruf. Why does it do that? That's not simply about creating a social order. It's actually threatening men who divorce their wives badly or who treat them badly with going to hell, right? It's threatening them with a punishment in the afterlife. So it's a whole reframing of how we consider what pious action is, because as Feras was noting, then pious action simply becomes every action, and action is even not what you're even doing. It also includes what you're kind of thinking, what you're feeling, and all of these aspects of a human being can be trained, right? Just as your eyes are to be trained, right, to look at the signs of God and not to look at the the things that are unseemly, right? And the body is trained into doing things like prayer and fasting and not doing the fahisha or illicit acts, right? And so indeed in the interior of a person, there can also be this training that occurs, right? Where the moral training is not simply about the acts that are expressed in an exterior way, but that it's self-reinforcing with the interior acts as well.
This is you know, this is potentially taking us off topic, but it's such an important point. I want to just this is a kind of a shout out to Karen, my colleague, for actually pointing that out about the immensity and the importance of the emotional discipline required to actually undertake that pious journey, that transformation, and in fact to understand how acts and you know, transactions and behavior all matter requires an immense amount of emotional discipline, I think, and that the Quran just assumes that people get that, and I don't think enough readers of the Quran understand that. And I think it's very clear that how you discipline your emotions means your ability to then discipline how you think about things, and because of course that generates emotions is so all encompassing, to intellectual processes, but also to embodied acts. So I think it's just I just want to say that watch that space where probably Karen will produce a monograph on emotions in the Quran.
I'm writing it now, so. But yeah,
it's incredibly taken for granted that we understand what that means, but actually it's a big lacuna in the field.
Yeah.
So.
But what all of that is to say is that kind of the act of piety, we would look at a verse like 33, 35 and say, oh, well, the people who are believing and the people who pray and the people who fast, okay, those, but you have to compare it as well with something like Baqarah 177, where it's not enough that you turn your face to the east or the west, right? What does that mean? It means that there has to be the proper interior orientation as well. And that does get into the question of like law and morality, which I think was something that you wanted to.
Yes.
We are circling back here to the question of women, don't worry.
Yes.
It was just so fundamental to understand that actually, no, the major question is just so beyond gender, and yet the text is so acknowledging a social sphere in which gender really matters and is really, crucial. Because of course, then what you mean is that what that means is that if the social life is arranged in households, and you have these male heads of households who are the heads of household, but who are also undertaking like patronage, right? So the rich people would have been patrons of the poor. These households would have been massive, right? With all the relatives and everybody coming in, and all the unmarried women who might have been minor relatives or just who needed a space would also be living there, right? Because they wouldn't be living alone. And so then how do you behave in those spaces? It's not even that much of a private space anymore. It's a semi-private space where you have times of real privacy, maybe between husband and wife, but you also really have a lot of people around as well. And that's very typical of late antiquity, by the way. I've now been reading a lot about late antiquity, and that's just how households were. And so we could go on and on.
Yeah, that's true. But also, since you led us very nicely to the other question. So this, piety that one has to enact, and you both very well do it. Emphasize that it implies the not just the rituals, but the emotions, the disposition. It's about discipline. Discipline. You use that word, and of course, Karen wrote very beautiful articles on emotions, and I'm glad that you're doing a book on that. But also you highlight, as you said, Karen and Feras, in your book, it's within this 7th century Arabia, male-headed household, hierarchical. So it's about, hey, you the male who's responsible in this extended household under a lot of vulnerable categories, including women, right? You behave, don't oppress. And you talk a lot about how, okay, this piety, this morality, this idea of being moral and striving to be moral, the Quran assumes it is happening with this hierarchy, right? Yes. But then you do a very interesting thing about explaining the word patron. God is wali, this male head is a wali, but everybody, then you say the Quran reverses that, and everybody can be, through their moral agency, become a patron of piety. Can you explain that for us? So the hierarchy part and the moral agency part.
I think Feras will have a lot to say, but I will just jump in first and say this was something major for us when we got this. It was something where suddenly the social structures of late antiquity, which is it's a patronage society, right? And what that means is that on a very basic and kind of transactional level, it means that you do favors for some rich person who's your patron, and they do favors for you. You show them your loyalty, they protect you. We see it today even in some political systems, maybe all political systems a little, and so but in a patronage society, there's of course not a separate structure of government that is supposed to be protecting people. It all happens within that kind of hierarchical structure. The problem with that hierarchical structure, just to stick with the actual practical problems, is that of course it's rife with abuse. It's prone to abuse. you know, somebody who's constantly getting the flattery of the people around him, so because he has the power to do these favors, you can see where it's going. I mean, it can go very bad places almost instantly. You know, you get there really quickly because of human nature, the nafs, right? And commanding to evil and being prone to that kind of thing. So and Feras, I should really let you cover this because Feras is the one who noticed this. We were talking about patronage, and suddenly, I don't remember if you left me a voice note or if we were in a meeting, but you just said, hang on, the language of patronage is everywhere in the Quran, and it's this God patronage. And so what's happening is that rather than that male head of household being the actual patron, God becomes the actual patron of all believers. And he's the patron of that head of household, but of every other believer too. I don't know if you want to take it from there, Feras. I mean, I could go on, but it's your thing, really. You were the one who.
You should do. Yeah, I think so. It's a point about language again, and I think it's clear that, you know, the Quranic language, the Arabic language of the Quran, has so many ways of denoting important reciprocal social ties. So it, you know, the constructions, as those of us who have some smattering of Arabic will know that the fa'il pattern of words is an intensifier of that root. So whatever you put in that pattern of fa'il, such as, let's say, nasir, as opposed to nasr, gives it an intensity. And I think that intensity is captured by a range of vocabulary in the Quran. From nasir to wakil to shafi' means intercessor, means guardian, means supporter. I mean, a lot of these, it meant that the social ties were extremely important to the people who spoke that language. And the Quranic message was trying to reverse the evaluation around those social ties by saying, well, if you can funnel those social ties towards a higher purpose, that of the kind of, you know, the God being ultimately, whatever human beings can do for you, it's limited. But the prize with God is immense. So why not think of God as the reciprocal agent here, as opposed to your, you know, there's nothing wrong with thinking of your neighbor as your guardian or your supporter, your wakil or your shafi'a. But I think the evaluation that the Quran introduces is that God is the best wakil, God is the best nasir, God is the best. And so a range of socially important concepts captured by vocabulary in the Quran are then refracted onto God. And so that's the focus now. And that's new.
And can I say that then the reciprocity becomes that when the Quran says that humans were made to you know, to abudun, you know, to worship him, right? It doesn't mean worship, it really means serve, okay? That's what I would say, is that service then, the reciprocity becomes that you do the service for God in this life, and then he rewards you in the next life. And the reciprocity is no longer is taken away in some sense from that human relationship and moved to this higher realm. And what is that service? That is being good to other people. That is giving your zakat. That is, you know, paying the proper nafaka for your whole household. That is looking after people. That is being good to people. And you know, because that's the thing that the Quran is commanding people to do over and over again, all the time, right? Is being good to others. And so that's the service. It's that, you know, when you like perform the sacrifice, you then give away some of the animal, right? You don't it's not that you leave some kind of offering for God. God doesn't eat the offering, right? That's what the Quran says. It doesn't, God will not eat it, right? What you do is you do it in God's name, then you distribute it to the poor, so that then that is your offering to God, is the care of the poor, you see? And so that's where, and then you don't ask them for the reward. That's what, of course, it says in Al-Insan and many other places. And prophets never ask their people for a reward. The reward, that reciprocity, is not the favors that you'll get in this life. It's the actual favor that that's you're giving the loan to God, right? And then he's repaying you double in the afterlife. That's what it's about.
Right. I want to get to the other point, but I would add to that then, and within that 7th century hierarchical society that the Quran assumes, right? It acts as a way of reforming and
Yes.
you're kind of like telling the elites, behave, don't abuse your power, and at the same
Precisely.
time provides an access to those that even the vulnerable, you have moral agency.
That's precisely it. And then that moral agency, okay, that's precisely it, Mulki. And that's exactly what our argument was, is that almost all the verses that are addressed to men about women, which has been a major problem for modern feminists. Why does the Quran address men about women? But it's actually trying to put a brake on them, and trying to impose rules, right? Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly
I want to
right.
get the question of law because my colleague is telling me I have 10 minutes, and that's also a very important question to me and to many of us also here, my colleagues. So I think one of the really, I thought was really, and I think other colleagues also pointed out to you in other discussions you've had about this book, is how you really provide a fresh understanding about the nature of Quranic law and ethics and how they are very much interconnected. And I want to tie this very quickly to also critiques that you often voiced about how the jurists really didn't get the historical context of the Quran. And I'm going to ask a lot from you because I only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to combine things together under the question of law and ethics, particularly the nature of the Quranic ethics. And I want to tie it to because, as you know, here, those of us who are working in Musawa, we're interested in Islamic family law, and many of our Muslim majority family laws are based on the fiqh that assumes the Quran as the source of law, then the Sunnah and the Qiyas and the Ijma and all that, and then the jurists often focused on these ayat al-ahkam. But you present completely a different approach. How you do this developmental approach. You show us also how these let's look at the early Meccan verses. Let's look what's the critique there that the Quran is putting forward. Then the later Meccan verses and how the question of moral agency, but also how the narratives are relevant to the Quranic law. And then in the Medinan verses, they're kind of like fleshed out. So can you tell us exactly how do you see the nature of the Quranic law? And it's in very much organic link to ethics, I believe. That's what I got from your book. And tie that to perhaps a critique of how jurists understood the Quran as a source of law.
Well, let me
go ahead.
I love this question because it's where I get to bash the jurists for a little bit, and only by highlighting. I mean, I don't think we ought to bash ultimately the language or the mechanics of jurisprudence. I think fiqh picked up on some kind of analogical and hence reason-based issue, which has not been done justice to. I think it's an immensely useful method, but I do want to bash the jurists for actually not being historical when the Quran was being historical. In other words, they dehistoricized a lot of what the Quran was commanding in a historical context, right? And I think we just recently, Karen and I were discussing how the Quran kind of modifies certain laws and certain behaviors as the stories unfolding in the Quran, which clearly suggests that law, or whatever you want to think about it, let's just use law/ethics, or rather just law, actually, let's just be practical. Law is dynamic. I mean, law is supposed to kind of adjust to the times in which it's supposed to be useful. And the Quranic narration shows that very clearly. There's a progression. And there's minimums and maximums, there's changes, there's fluctuation. If just that as a point of the continuously kind of dynamic nature of the Quranic legal narration, if one must, in that short space of time, establishes one thing, is that law cannot be static. And yet the jurisprudential body, I think, the entire edifice of fiqh has been, I think, as you know better than anybody, has been quite static since the 7th century.
But it's not just that, it's that they take things that were meant to limit men's power and they take them and they assume that they're actually meant to, they assume that this is a minimum, right? This is just like if you take the, wife, the question of, whether a man can, I mean, it's too big to get into right here, but they'll say, oh yes, he can do anything short of killing her. I mean, what? I literally don't understand how you could possibly read the Quran and ever get to anything like that. So it's not only that it's static, it's that they take something that's clearly meant to say to men, look, this is a widespread practice. We know you're all doing it, but like, you just need to limit this. It cannot be for anything. It has to be very, very limited and very, very specific. And, which is clearly a limiting, to prevent worse harm. So actually, after this book, we wrote an article on ethics and law because we weren't finished with that subject. And I'll just summarize a couple of the major points in it because they're really relevant to this. We noticed that there are well, first of all, we don't think that you can necessarily separate out ethics from law because although, okay, it's a very complex point, but what people will assume is that the law is a minimum thing, like it's the worst thing that you can do, and then ethics is higher than the law, right? But we think that could be a flawed way of looking at what happens in the Quran. So one thing is that you can notice that there are different types of command, right? There's one that has a minimum but no maximum. Prayer, remembering God, right? There's a minimum. You should do it all the time. There's never a maximum to that stuff, right? You can just do it as much as you can. There's another thing, which is what we call safeguarding against worse harm, or a prevention law, preventing worse harm. And those, I always think you have to think about the character of the people being addressed. So if you're having to tell a man who has female guardians in his care that rather than abusing them or taking all their money, he should marry them and give them a dowry, what kind of a person is that? It's clearly somebody who needs something like a clear boundary so that he's not going to do some kind of major moral harm. It doesn't mean that this is like some kind of license for everybody to do that kind of thing. It means those bad people who now have unlimited social power because of the social structures that we were talking about. Look, you can't just have unlimited power over those people. That's just impossible. So we would say that there's a sort of law or a sort of command which is not ideal, actually. It seems as though it's okay, but it's not ideal. And then it's just to prevent worse harm. And this is where you get the moral good. You get the idea that you could do better. But we wouldn't say that that's just ethics and law. We would say that actually in the Quran, you could maybe even consider it as being more abiding of the law. Like if you're doing better, then you're doing it better. You're doing the law better. You're not. Yeah. And then there's a third thing, which is what Feras is getting at, is that there's dynamic laws. There are temporary laws in the Quran very clearly. Most times and places, the standard for kind of being saved is very clear. It's you pray, you be good, you give your zakat, you're a believer, you can get to the afterlife, for kind of but there's these moments of warfare when if you turn away from that battle, suddenly you're not saved anymore. What's that like? It's like in my mind akin to the COVID laws or something. It's a temporary moment where people have to be, where something has to be imposed. Anyway, so the key point that is the one that Feras made, of course, which is that it's in a historical context, and the law itself in the Quran is very dynamic. And that's not it's not just one kind of going towards that end, because of course then you have these other things like in Al-Mumtahana where where there's just a negotiation with the unbelievers. It's not killing them. It's like the unbelieving woman leaves the believers and goes to the unbelievers. The believing women leave the unbelievers and come. Her husbands say nothing about it. they just negotiate the kind of dowry together, or the marital. And so clearly they're living alongside each other. There are just these moments when extra duties are imposed. So I think that people have the habit of looking at the Quran as being something unnuanced. Like
Right.
there's no nuance whatsoever in this, but it's full of all kinds of nuance. And yeah, I think we
And
probably,
people will want to get this a reference for that article about ethics and law, but also this reflects, because our audience have been very patient, this
Yeah.
reflects, this invites a reflection also on, okay, first of all, which I want the readers who haven't had a chance, the audience, to read it, to emphasize, like, okay, how do you read the Quran to get at that? Like, do you just read some verses here and there, or to look at your methodology, but also for those who are interested and want to work with the premise, the Quran as a source of law, then maybe revisiting the usul al-fiqh and the theory, like, and that's a whole another debate, right? But then our audience have been very, very patient, and at the end, maybe I also want to highlight some certain, or maybe give you the chance after you hear from them to highlight some misconceptions that you don't want people to leave away with. I know at least two. I believe that you don't want everybody to think that, this book is not about that, right? But
Yeah.
so, Sophia, I want to be respectful of our audience, our colleagues, and give them a chance to ask, because you told me I only had 10 minutes, and that was a while ago. Shall I hand it over to you? Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, Mulki.
thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. And really, I feel terrible that we're having to break it up. I wish we could carry on just listening to the three of you in conversation, but we do have questions from the audience, which of course we want to honor. I think perhaps one of the most important interventions that has been made through this book and through your work more generally, and is being highlighted in this conversation, is to close that gap between ethics and law, because it's in the gap, in that dislocation that happens between ethics and law, that so much violence takes place and is justified by the idea, well, legally speaking, jurisprudentially speaking, it's okay. And, ethics sort of seems to take a back seat. And in that, so much violence happens.
Yeah. Can I just say on that for this article that has not yet been published, Feras probably doesn't remember it, but he said he made this brilliant intervention at some point. In modern legal systems, you can be morally bankrupt and still be abiding by the law, but that is not Quranic law. That's just the opposite of it. If you're morally bankrupt, then you're morally bankrupt. That is not abiding by any law, any of God's law, right?
I mean, it's an intrinsic flaw that is being exposed in that, right? So if God's law, supposedly God's law, is allowing and facilitating your moral bankruptcy, can that really be God's law still?
Yeah.
But to bring it back to the question that's been asked, central to the argument in the book, and you've touched on it in our conversation, is what you call the charisma of the Quran, the salvific narrative, right? But there's a question that we have from one of our audience members who's asking to interrogate this notion of salvation a little bit more. She's written, would you please explain what you mean by salvation, since to her knowledge, this word or meaning is not specifically in the Quran?
Oh, I think I'll take that one. It's my favorite, because the fact that somebody has to ask that question about the Quran is itself an indication of how we've forgotten how central that whole notion is. That's all that the Quran is about. If I can be so crass and crude to summarize, that the Quran is about nothing more than continuing life into the next realm. And that we call salvation, because if you're saved, you get there. And if you're not saved, you end up in some dark spot. I mean, I don't want to go into the details or the gory details, but are we seriously not cognizant of the fact that these religious traditions came down with a message that there is life after death, and that life is the kind of true life and the true extension of the possibilities that we experience here? That in itself tells me about the sort of I think the challenge of understanding, because if we're challenged and recognizing that about the Quran, we're going to be challenged with recognizing a whole bunch of interrelated questions, such as the one that we're talking about today. I think law, ethics, jurisprudence, women, It all comes in a bag. So just respectfully to the question from the audience, I mean, the Quran is nothing, if anything, about it's about anything rather. It's about how do you merit life in the next world, because that is why God kind of created us in some sense, and it's central to that. And so it's in fact so central that there is no constructed word for it. We don't, we have a word for it because we've since decided that religion is separate from a lot of the other things that we do in life. So we've kind of, it's part of the same original problem of discourse that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. We need a language that separates the sacred from the profane, the everyday from the religious, in order to kind of, to manage our contemporary kind of priorities and sensibilities and our kind of cultural modes and so on. But that's not the world of the Quran. The world of the Quran is the world in its entirety, and the transition is to a hereafter. That's all that message is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That there's not and yeah, absolutely. Actually, I'm not going to add anything. I did have a thought, but I forget it now. So go ahead. Yes, that's beautiful, Feras. Perfect. That's right.
Thank you. We have so again at the beginning of this conversation, and this is something that you illustrate really well in the book as well, the notion that the Quran speaks to believers, and there's not this distinction between men and women. But as you look at the chronological revelation of the Quran, you find that there is an attention that is given to women, and use that really to illustrate the ethical narrative that the Quran is trying to impart on believers. So there's a question here specifically on Muslim women then, and ideals of what a Muslim woman looks like. Our questioner has asked, what are your thoughts on Muslim women being perceived as less pious due to their inability to embody traditional interpretations of the so-called ideal woman? For example, based on certain interpretation, righteous women are defined to be those who prioritize serving their families, mostly within the confinement of their households. However, many women today may aspire to contribute in the public sphere as well, which may require them to compromise or appear to compromise some of their piety within their homes. So I suppose the question really is one about the construction of piety as it is relevant to women. Because the Quran does seem to address piety specifically in women, and then bringing that back perhaps to the idea that there's no real distinction being made.
So should I take this for a second, Feras? Okay. So first of all, I think that the construction of womanhood that we have here is not necessarily the construction that we see in the Quran. Okay. I mean, I'm not saying that it wasn't taken for granted that women would breastfeed, for instance. You can see that represented in the Quran. They can discuss the husband and wife for how long she does that, and they can agree on that. But because that's how babies were made, and that's how, there wasn't formula, right? Okay, 7th century Arabia, right? So I'm not trying to say that there's no aspects, but I think that I think that there are a lot of modern assumptions being put on the idea of womanhood in the Quran. What we actually see women doing in the Quran, right, is what we've actually seen is, for instance, in Al-Mumtahana, as we already mentioned, if a woman is a believer, she can leave her unbelieving husband. That surah says literally nothing about the husband's right over her, or whether he's going to divorce her or not. She just leaves. She just goes, see you later, and joins the believers. Equally, if a woman is an unbeliever and she's with a believer, he's told just let her go if she wants to. She can. It's her moral choices are determining her social choices. We have Mary, of course. I mean, I know that you might not think that she's a model of piety, but we would think that she's a model of piety for everyone. She goes off and secludes herself away from her household. Why would she need to do that? Because in late antiquity, there was a model of female saints who would go off into the desert as well, and they would seek communion with God. Okay, so there were male saints who did that, but of course, they're not really represented in the Quran. Only Mary is, right? So this is very clear. that she is seeking a communion with God and being away from her household, and she gets that. She is visited, she has Jesus, she gets that. And I think that Moses's mother is actually kind of asked to give up her role as a mother, to give away Moses. I think that to put on these modern standards as though women are expected. There's Al-Mujadila, right? Who is alone with the prophet complaining about her husband's ill behavior. And you know this because the Quran speaks in the dual, and it says God has heard her because he was the only other one present. And then the surah goes on to explain that if you're a group of 2 people, God is the third. If you're a group of 3 people, God is the fourth. If you're a group of, etc., right? And so it's explaining that there were only the 2 of them in that room, and she's complaining about her husband, and she's vindicated, right? He was doing wrong. And no, women were not stuck inside. I mean, why else would they have to cover themselves with their cloaks when they go out? They're covering themselves with their cloaks because they're going out, right? And I mean, you do have the verse that says to the wives of the prophet, stay in your houses and don't display yourself, or don't be how would you say tabarruj, Feras, like
You just have to look
flaunt,
at
yeah.
modern Instagrams and you get the idea.
Yeah, exactly. Don't flaunt it. Don't flaunt yourselves. But I mean, that's very, very different from saying women never leave the house. That's saying exactly, don't go out looking for that kind of attention, because you have to have your dignity. And the prophet wears a cloak too, right? He's al-muzammil, he's al-mudaththar. He's wearing a cloak. The women are wearing cloaks around themselves to distinguish them as people who are adhering to this new faith, right? And when they go out, so that they're not harassed, okay? So I think that it's damaging to kind of put on modern preconceptions about what it meant to be a woman. I don't know. So Firas, I've spoken.
No, I'm not going to add anything to that, Karen, except to say that I think we sometimes overlook the very important portrait of the kind of true servant in the Quran, which is modesty, full stop. And that modesty is not limited to an anthropology of dress. It's a disposition, and it's an emotional configuration.
For men and women.
Of men and for women, absolutely. And in fact, it can be, and the same can happen for both. I mean, both can spiral into a kind of almost a pornography of the body, or they can kind of become modest or even more modest. So I think it's also to do with the disposition that comes with the emotional orientation to be pious, to watch one's language, to watch one's behavior, and so on. And of course, that's the idea of the rituals then feeding into that, the fasting, the prayers, all of that, all of those disciplining moments, so that the emotions are balanced and kind of virtuous. Yeah.
Yeah. So to answer much more directly the questioner, and about, what if I just go out and work? Should I be at home taking care of my kids? What if I don't have kids? Should I be having them instead? I think that's not it's how are you going out to work? It's how are you looking after the people in your life? It's how are you, that's the central question, really. It's how you're doing your life. It's not, I don't think that it's putting forth some kind of ideal, like a modern idea of barefoot and pregnant or something, that you have to be in the home in some kind of way, right? In that way. Yeah.
And perhaps very quickly, if I can add, maybe it has also to do with if you're going to say, okay, I need to find the answer for this question from the Quran, how do you engage with it? How do you read? You were mentioning, Karen, for example, the stories, the biblical stories, and and how do you make moral choices? So do you look and try to get at an overall framework on how you should carry yourself and develop that piety on so many different levels, rather than very specific verses and injunctions?
That's it, Moki. And that goes back to what you were saying, which is also our point, which is that we have a tendency to think of the Quran as a piecemeal text. Oh, I'll take out this verse, and that's what the Quran means, or this verse. And when you read Feras is another gem from you, Feras, is piecemeal method, piecemeal results, right? You'll never gain any kind of understanding of it, of the moral trajectory if you take out that tiny phrase on the prophet's wives and you think that that's actually you amplify it to something that it was never meant to say in the first place. That's not at all what's going on there, right? Yeah, so it's important to look at it in a much wider context of what's actually the message, and what questions does it want to answer, and what questions is it not actually that concerned with, right? Not actually, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to take, I think one more question is all we've got time for from the audience. Unfortunately, time's gone by so quickly. So there's a question here from the audience. What can be the potentiality of moral agency to improve the modern legal system? As you said, the concept of ethics and law in the Qur'an is different from modern law.
Can you repeat that, actually?
Sure. Yeah. So what can be the potentiality of moral agency to improve the modern legal system? As you said, the concept of ethics and law in the Quran is different from modern law. I wonder if this is perhaps speaking more to contexts in which so-called Islamic law is being applied, and I guess the implications of your findings in practical terms, perhaps.
I think with our point, Karen might rapidly remind me of something I'd forgotten, but I think when we chanced upon the idea of expressing that finding as moral agency was simply to really restate the idea that, both men and women are in this bind. I mean, they have to get through this life in a virtuous way. And the social hierarchy then is kind of somehow destabilized, because if you think of yourself as always being stuck in some hierarchy, some people are born rich, some people are born privileged, some people are educated, some are not, and so on. But actually at the core, human beings know. I think that's a central message of the Quran. I think that human beings fundamentally know what we call good or khair, and what we call evil or shar. And in fact, I think that's it's the human inability to confront that truth that's the real pathological kind of crisis I think the Quran sees. That the human beings know somehow innately know. And because by the way, this is not something that we've discussed with Karen, so she might disagree, but I do want to use her argument as a foil, because there's an emotional content there that is clear to the doer of an evil act or a good act, at least for the 90% that I can think of what in reality is a good act and what is an evil act. And I think there is a kind of sense in the Quran that pathology is deeply kind of a source of crisis for human beings.
Right.
But that doesn't detract from their agency. In fact, their agency, that's how the agency is tested. But Karen, you wanted to say something, so
and I want to also add to the question very quickly, Karen, before you take it. Can I? And then you can, but because also to just tease it out a little bit. So does that mean what you're saying, Feras, is then what we can take away from this understanding of moral agency and what the Quran is saying about that can happen within a realm where it's the individual within a certain collective is doing that work or wants to do that work, is striving to do that work, but cannot really work, and I'm going to be provocative here, within a framework where it's a state law. And I think this question is getting there, if I understand it correctly. Like, you can't do that where it's a state law. There's a family law, applied by Egypt, Morocco, whatever, and says, hey, this is how you're gonna marry, this is how you're gonna divorce, this, yeah. So Karen, take it away.
How child custody works, etc.
Exactly, yeah.
I think that the issue is that those laws in the Quran, those bits of the Quran that talk about divorce, for instance, were meant to mitigate harm, right? And what they've been taken as in the legal culture is an opportunity to instigate subjugation, right? To actually, there's nothing in the Quran that says anything about women should not leave the house between their marriage and their death. I mean, that's something that jurists literally made up. Okay, I'm going to just be very provocative and say that they actually just they're not getting that. That goes against what was clearly happening in the Quran. Okay, and so I think that once you look at law as okay, so the function of law may be as preventing harm in its most basic sense. Obviously, in morality, and when we take into account moral law or God's law, you would be actually trying to do good rather than just preventing harm. And that means maybe looking after people in society, right? But the danger very much comes in when people don't recognize that as Feras was noting, that they don't recognize their own propensity to go for power and to enshrine that in the law. Since of course as all of us know, the legal tradition was entirely male dominated through all of Islamic history, they're not naturally going to give women more rights, are they? And so I think that the danger comes now today when as Muki says, that somehow this thing that was Islamic law, that's again already very far from what the Quran was doing, is then put into a state law that then creates a lot of harm, rather than it has the opposite effect of what the Quran was intending, right? And so I think that that's a very dangerous, it's very hard to say, well, we've done this because it's in the Quran and that's the, that's God's law. But I think that you really do have to, I mean, Firas, maybe you have you want to say something now. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I think that's a good enough, I think, summary of the response. I am just conscious of what other questions there might be. I'm not sure what the time.
Yeah. Well, it's this idea that you had in the beginning that you mentioned earlier, which was, law in the Quran as well as dynamic. And it's dynamic. Some parts are meant to prevent harm. Some parts are meant to actually ensure that good is being done, that people are living according to a higher standard. So shouldn't I think that the danger is when state law is imposed that's doing none of those things, right? It's not preventing harm, it's causing great harm, and it's not dynamic, it's not responding to current circumstances, when of course most women around the world are working. I mean, it's not a time when, and most women are contributing fully to their households. It's not a time when that patronage system is working in the same way. And we have states that can protect us now as well, or that should seek to protect, the poor and the vulnerable. So it's a very, it's really, I think it can become very difficult and very damaging when the Quran is not understood as something that was dynamic in its own time, actually. And when you're taking something that's in there and imagining that those few words are the thing that's true for all of time, rather than the concept. Or some, I don't know.
There's one other thing, Sophia, that's really important about the point related to the point of moral agency, which is that there is, and this is a product of kind of the cultural sensibilities, I think, of the last few hundred years, as kind of, I would kind of, safely say, somewhat, can I say it kind of comes from a kind of Western approach to life on Earth, which is that the idea that this life ought to be paradisiacal, or that there is the possibility of paradise on Earth, I think is something that I think drives a lot of reformist, activist, and I'm not talking about Islamic context, but broadly speaking, all major political ideologies try to kind of enact a kind of perfect scenario, or the possibility of a perfect scenario on Earth. And I don't think that the Quran is so much obsessed with that, if at all. I think the idea of moral agency is that you understand your place within the life as a moral test. And I think the insistence by the Quran on the idea of endurance, full stop, as a virtue. I mean, enduring. I know it sounds difficult, and it's very troubling to kind of speak about that from a privileged position of being safely here behind a screen, while there's impending disasters and kind of humanitarian catastrophes across the world. But I do believe it is a central Quranic message that moral agency is to let the individual agent know that they can do something about the choice. And that choice can sometimes be simply not an act, but a disposition, an emotional disposition.
But also, it's equally really important to recognize that the entire concept of endurance has also been hijacked by the patriarchy, right? I mean, let's recognize that full stop, right, Feras? I mean, we've seen it that what ends up happening is this key and central concept that's applied beautifully and equally to all pious believers and everybody equally in the Quran, sabr, which the Prophet has to do, which everybody has to do, right? Everybody has to endure hardship, is somehow applied to women that, just bear with it. He might beat you a little, just bear with it. That's not at all what's going on here, right? And that's not what Feras is trying to say at all, right?
I mean, otherwise you'd be hijacking my language. You'd be doing what the jurisprudence do, which
exactly.
I don't. So I think it's clear to those listening to what I'm saying that actually that's also an example of how the entire tradition has been hijacked. I mean, I think it's, endurance was used by the Umayyads to keep, beating up the other political opponents. This is what God wants, just endure it. Absolutely not. I mean, it's a catastrophe. I think the real problem, I think, is that there is a vision of a society in the Quran that is yet to be produced. I think that the one that we have now, that we've had since the 7th century, I think is a permutation. It's one possible Islamic society. And I would venture to say that it sufficed for about 100 years, probably just for the 8th century, but it's never really moved on. And I don't think it's yet to unfold the vision. Otherwise, somebody has to clearly explain to me the dissonance, the dissonance between the edifice of jurisprudence, the modern reality out there, regardless of whether it's Islamic laws, Western laws, or Japanese laws, justice, and the Quran. I mean, there's a dissonance, there's a fragmentation between all of those points. So there's clearly a challenge. There's something that's deeply misunderstood. And since jurisprudence thinks it's understood the problem, then the misunderstanding must be somewhere else. I mean, and clearly the Quran is misunderstood. I think that's a serious problem. I'm not sure whether you could solve it, and that's a debate for another context, whether you could solve it through the instruments of jurisprudence, or would you require to in fact delete the entire edifice? Because there is a very reasonably logical argument that any law that enacts justice is an Islamic law, right? We know this. And it doesn't have to be what is so Islamic, what is sort of non-Islamic about any potentially just law, right? And I think it goes back to the idea that the Quran captures a society in the 7th century, captures some of its injustices. And by the way, Mulki, just to go back to Sophia, forgive me, because I remembered that when we began, we talked about the central. I'll give you a central irony about this, which is that women are central to the Quran precisely because they're a central example of how injustice is committed. Yeah. So in that sense, they're absolutely central. So just to recap,
and this is what it's exactly the irony. That's exactly it. Is it so nuts? It's like that they're being given as the example of, okay, here's this whole constituency, half the population. If you're treating them badly, we're going to tell you that if you're not even decent to them, not even treating them badly, if you're just not even decent, treating them bil ma'ruf, if you don't treat them well, essentially, then that jeopardizes your own salvation. And yet that very text is being used to oppress people, or some kind of interpretation of it. Yeah, it's very disappointing. I did notice in the chat that there were two things that I wanted to address very, very briefly. One of them was, you know, this idea that in the very early centuries, everything was perfect. I'm really not sure, you know. I just have to say that I'm really not sure about that. Like people have, I would really, you know, push back on the idea that everything was immediately perfect and that there was a perfect implementation of the Sharia in the beginning. I'm not sure about that. Okay, and another question was, you know, how can we take academic discussions like this and bring it to a wider audience and bring it into practice? I think that that's a great question, and I don't necessarily have the answer because I'm very much an academic, but we would like to do that actually. This kind of discussion I think is important, and you know, we should we should continue to try to think of ways to bring these kinds of conversations into the more mainstream and into people's kind of
Yeah, and I can think of one very specific suggestion of how to do that. I would say is like maybe we can think of you know, some kind of activity where we get together and maybe you would like to show people how we can read the Quran differently. You know.
Yeah,
Right?
especially in terms
Whatever
of the
theme
ethics.
you take, whatever theme, you know,
Yeah.
the methodology of how, even if you're not an academic or something, but you're very much interested
Yeah.
in the moral worldview of this text, you know, like, okay, how would you, and because that, sorry, Sophia, I didn't mean to hijack, but I was just responding to Karen very quickly of her
That's
suggestion.
absolutely fine. It's always nice to hear from you as well, Mulki. And I'm afraid that I'm going to have to bring it all to an end today for this evening or morning or afternoon, wherever people are in the world. I think if anything else, this conversation should hopefully have whet everybody's appetite to go out and get themselves a copy of Women, Households, and the Hereafter in the Qur'an, a Patronage of Piety. And I'm sure many of the questions that have been asked will be answered in there as well. And we hope that we will be able to have Karen and Feras with us again. Hopefully this is the first of many conversations with them. And we invite our audience to also get in touch with both of them. They are both, you know, open to continuing conversations beyond these and publicly engaging with others too. So please don't see this as the beginning and end of a conversation, but the start of many, many conversations, hopefully. So I'd just like to thank Karen and Feras and Mulki for the beautiful conversation that we've all been privileged to be a part of. And I will hand over to Miza.
And thank you from me to Karen and Feras. Thank you so much. It was a privilege.
Thank you, Mulki, and thank you everybody, Sophia, Mulki, and everybody else who made this possible, but especially Mulki for your deep engagement and for your really, truly wonderful questions. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
I don't think we've had as close a reading of our book as that of Mulki's. I think it could generate a series of webinars. I know we're very appreciative of that. So, but I also just thank you to Musawa, actually to our colleagues, our wonderful colleagues, and Ziba for actually the original idea, and Mulki for participating and helping and moderating, and Sophia. It's been a pleasure. I just want to also apologize that actually there are a bunch of questions in the webinar chat. So please, I think we have a protocol, as you just perhaps captured, Sophia, that they could contact us, because I caught some of them and I have answers, but we don't have time.
Yeah, so that's the problem. We only saw some of them, and then we have these answers, and we really, really want to discuss it more. So
it's difficult to attend to the conversation and to the questions, you know, cognitively at the same time. But anyway, thank you all. Thanks, of course, to our audience for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
Miza.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen, Professor Feras, Professor Mulki, and Dr. Sophia for this illuminating discussion. And thank you to our audience for your attention throughout the webinar and your valuable questions to the speakers. So there will be more webinars like this one coming soon, and we hope that you will be able to join us for those. Please check our website, www.musawa.org, or follow us on social media for more information. But before you leave, please answer the feedback form that's in the chat. We really want to improve in the future as well, so that you will get to have better webinars. On 10th December, Tuesday, we and our partners are organizing a webinar called Challenging the Taliban's Mistreatment of Women from an Islamic and Human Rights Perspective. So for more information on this, if you're interested, please check out our social media platforms or just email musawa@musawa.org. Thank you so much, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Good night, good evening. Enjoy your day, enjoy your evening. Thank you.